According to the HMS Hood Association, the hood had dual degaussing cables around the bow and stern, and a single degaussing cable midship. The FlyHawk Super Detail Upgrade Kit came with this degaussing cable, and I have determined that it is capable of making its way around the entire ship once. And that is a bit of a problem, because I need dual degaussing cables at the bow and stern of the ship. Fortunately, I have built other ships, and I keep the excess parts from those ships. I don't throw away anything. So as it happens, I have degaussing cable from the Nagato and the Yamato. There is yet again one minor problem, and that is that the spacing of the clips is slightly longer on this FlyHawk kit than it is on these Lion Roar kits. When looking at photos of the hood, it looks as though the spacing of the clips is actually closer to that of these Lion Roar degaussing cables than it is of the provided FlyHawk degaussing cable. Another point that the HMS Hood Association makes is that the upper degaussing cable in the bow and stern of the ship is actually slightly narrower than that goes around the full length of the ship. Of these two degaussing cables, the one for the Yamato is slightly thinner than for the one of the Nagato. So if it is the case that I have enough of the Nagato degaussing cable to make it around the full perimeter of the ship, and then enough of the Yamato degaussing cable to make it around the upper section of the bow and stern of the ship, then I can do a full replacement of that FlyHawk degaussing cable with this unused degaussing cable from my Nagato and Yamato models. I have done the measurements, and I think there is enough of both, but I need to be sure before I start sticking parts down. So I'm going to cut out these pieces now and just place them on the deck just to make sure that I have enough to make it around the full ship. If you would like to see how this model got to this point, or if you would like to see where it goes from here, then you'll be pleased to know that this video is part of a build series. To view the series, follow the link to the playlist in the cards above. Also, consider subscribing to the channel to be notified when new videos are released and to help grow the channel. After convincing myself that it was a good idea to remove the plastic molding cable, it is now time to replace it with the photo-etch degaussing cable. As you previously heard, there is a lot of latitude that I have when replacing this degaussing cable. We know that historically the upper and lower degaussing cables on the bow and stern of the ship were installed as uniformly as possible, but that the fasteners did get out of line and that there were some areas that were a bit sloppier than others, which means that I am able to install this degaussing cable in such a way that it is not perfect and have it actually be historically representative. The precise locations of every fastener and the actual path of the cable will be different, but detail at that level is probably lost to history anyway. There are also some limitations with how much I can bend this degaussing cable, so the path that it follows is unlikely to be precisely accurate, but I think I can get it good enough to be passable. Before removing the molded degaussing cable, I did check to see that I had enough photo-etch degaussing cable to complete the installation. And while I was confident enough in the amount that I had to remove the molded degaussing cable, before I start gluing it down, I want to be 100% sure that I will be able to complete the job. To be sure, I cut the degaussing cable off the frets and place it on the deck, making sure that I can make my way around the entire perimeter. As you can see, the fit is tight, but it does make it. And at the bow of the ship, I will be using other shaped offcuts to complete that more complicated path that it follows. So I actually have a little bit more than laid out here. So at this point, I'm pretty sure that I have enough. Maybe not 100%, but 99%. I think that's good enough. I'm not worried about the upper section of degaussing cable. I have a lot of that, so I'm not going to worry about measuring it out. There will be plenty to make it around to the B and X turrets. To install the degaussing cable, I'm going to start at the bow. This is by far the most complicated portion of the cable to be installed, and a lot of that complexity sits around the horsepower openings for the anchors. Looking at these sheets from Nagato, I can see this piece is fairly well shaped to fit on this fairing. It will require a bit of bending to get it into the right shape, but it's a generally good approximation to start off with. Considering it is the lower piece, which means it's going to be in the inner portion of the bends need to be tighter on this one. So with the thinner upper cable, it should be easier to wrap it around the outer perimeter. So I'm going to start working this area and then expand it towards the bow to wrap it around to complete that front section from the bow to the aft of the horsepipe openings for the anchors. Using needle nose pliers, I bend the photo etch into the appropriate shape, and then apply extra thick superglue to the back of the photo etch, and then place it on the model in the location where I want it to sit. I'm only using the extra thick superglue to tack down the degaussing cable. I will then follow up with rounds of extra thin superglue applied with a wire to its edge to make a good bond with the ship. This is an iterative process, placing down the photo etch, bending it, placing it down, bending it until I get it into the shape that I'm happy with. If you do make a mistake, it's actually not that much of an issue. This photo etch is quite easy to remove with a knife. You just need to get it under one end and you can pull it back quite easily. After completing the lower section of degaussing cable, I then move on to completing the upper section. This is the thinner degaussing cable. While I do have a lot of this type of degaussing cable, I don't have any pieces with bends in it, which means I'm going to have to manually bend all of these parts. Fortunately, this is not too tricky. Once I have a section stuck down, I'm able to bend it with tweezers, and I'm trying to get it to follow as closely as possible the lower degaussing cable, bearing in mind that the fasteners do not need to stay aligned, and that in some places it can be installed a bit sloppily, and that will still be accurate. This hump over the anchor is going to be the most difficult section of this cable, but it's going well so far. It's not as bad as I thought it would be. It does bend fairly well. The trick is to keep it laying flat when bending, because if I pull it up then it rips it off the model, it breaks the superglue. These tight bends are the most difficult, but I'm getting there. Now that I have it in place, I'm just going to reinforce a bit with extra thin superglue. Let me accelerate that to make sure that it is properly bonded. That working quite well actually. Now to repeat this process for the starboard side of the ship. If I can get the bow right, I think the rest of the ship will come very easily. Once again, I'm looking for an appropriately shaped piece, and I suppose it isn't much of a surprise, but the same one that I used on the other side seems to work best over here. So I'll start with that piece again. It's the exact same process of bending these cables and getting them to fit in the approximate location. In the end, I used the same types of photo etch on both port and starboard side of the bow, which I suppose makes sense, because at least up until the first anchor, they are symmetrical. It's just now that with this upper piece of degaussing cable, I'm working in the opposite direction. I started at the anchor first and then moved towards the bow, and now obviously I start at the bow and I'm moving towards the anchor. Everything is reversed. It's mirrored. But it's actually going a little bit easier this way, I think. At least up until this point. The cable isn't tripping over itself as much. I suppose I'm just getting better at doing this. I'm not going to stick down the upper section of degaussing cable for now. I want to complete the lower section first, just to make sure that I clear the aft anchor. Now that I'm past the squiggly bits around the anchors, I can install a long straight piece of the lower degaussing cable. I place extra thick superglue at the front of the degaussing cable, and I align it with the already installed lower degaussing cable. I then pull it straight and apply extra thin superglue to its length to bond it to the side of the hull. I can then put on the aft bend on the upper degaussing cable, following the same process as before. Although it looks a bit off, this connection point is in line with the B turret. It looks like it's slightly forward of it, but that's just the camera angle. It's slightly more aft than it actually looks. And this is the point where I've merged the upper and lower degaussing cable into one, and that then becomes the connection point for the single degaussing cable that runs along the midship. This is straight at this point, so it's just a matter of lining up the degaussing cable and applying extra thin superglue to its side to bond it in place. In this section of the degaussing cable, it just happened that I had enough to make it precisely to the point where it needs to step down to the quarterdeck. I'm going to use an offcut from one of the other degaussing cable sections that I had been working with. Shortly after the transition to the quarterdeck on the port side of the ship, I need to also put a small dip into the degaussing cable. This is achieved by bending a long straight section. On the port side, this is as far as I want to go for now, because I think it's going to need to align with the dual railing that runs around the aft of the ship. So I'll move on to working on the starboard side. For the midship, the same process is followed as was followed on the port side of the ship. Over here, because of the extra lengths, because of the longer fairing on the starboard side of the ship, the photo-etch cable makes it beyond this drop down to the quarterdeck. So in this case, I'm going to simply bend the existing long straight degaussing cable into the appropriate shape. Although this does look slightly different compared to the port side of the ship, the reality is that it is on a different side of the ship. So you won't ever be able to do them side by side, so this slight difference will not be noticeable. If it were the case that these bends were to be next to each other and visible at the same time, then I would have constructed them both in the same way, whether that be by bending the cable like this or by cutting up sections to create those bends. I'm not sure which method I prefer. I think they both are pretty good. But in this case, what I should have done is I should have put both bends on before gluing it down, because it's a bit difficult to bend this photo etch while it's half stuck to the ship. But with a bit of rework, I got to where I needed it to be. This is where I'm going to stop on the starboard side of the ship, for the same reason as I stopped on the port side of the ship. I want to work on the dual rating section starting at the stern moving forward, and then rather have the joint in a single location. And I also want that joint to be pretty symmetrical about the ship. And I think it would be easier to get that right if I start from the stern rather than starting forward. What I can do is take one of these upper sections of degaussing cable, fold it in half, and then fix that at the stern, working forward. I then know whatever I do on the port side of the ship, if I do it on the starboard side of the ship, it will then end in the exact same location, abreast of the X turret. I place the folded upper degaussing cable at the stern of the ship, and then glue it down with extra thin superglue. I start by working on the starboard side of the ship, because it is simpler, there isn't that dip down that I need to get around. So the idea is to see what parts I need to get to the X turret. And it looks like a second length of this upper degaussing cable is pretty much perfect to get me to that location. So I glue it down and end it there. I have cut off one section so that I can make the merge, and I bend it down. And then repeat the process on the port side of the ship. Now to deal with the dipped degaussing cable. It transitions from the dipped single degaussing cable to the dual degaussing cable quite close to each other, which is a bit unfortunate. Adds a little bit of complexity because there's not much room to maneuver, but it's okay. After a bit of trial and error, I get the cable bent into the desired shape and cut to length, and then I place it into the location where I want it installed on the ship and glue it down with extra thin superglue. Moving back to the starboard side of the ship, and then install a section of degaussing cable that runs from the drop down to the quarterdeck all the way to the dual degaussing cables. More straight sections of the low degaussing cable are then installed, and on the port side this almost gets me to the very stern of the ship. Since there is a very small section missing over here, I'm going to move back to the starboard side and see if there's excess to take me around. And it turns out on the starboard side there will be excess. So I install that straight section of degaussing cable and bend it around onto the port side, cut it to the appropriate length, and complete the cable installation. In the next video, I'll be touching up the portholes. Some of these portholes are in the incorrect location and do need to be moved ever so slightly. If you would like to support this channel or see how this model looks when it is eventually completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.